Hello everyone, my name is Luke Whitehead and welcome once again to the Coach Dave Le Mans Ultimate YouTube channel, and I'm here today to guide you through this week's daily races on Le Mans Ultimate. Let's see what you've got in store. So, for ELMS Sprint Race we have a bit of a weird one this week. We have the Qatar Short layout, so only 6 or 7 corners to really go over if you choose to have the chicane as one corner, and I will do that for the purpose of this lap guide, so let's see how we get on. And let's see how we do this lap. So, coming to turn 1, we have a much more concrete braking point than we would at Fuji. Brake it just before the 50-meter board. You can brake at the 50, but I prefer to brake a little bit earlier and roll a bit more speed through. And you can see we brake just before the 50 down to gear 2. We are trailing off the brake quite soon. Just trying to get to the inside curb. And get back on the throttle around the midpoint of the corner. You can see we don't run out too wide. We just run out to that weird kind of curb, kind of faded curb on the left-hand side. If you run out too wide, it just leaves you a lot of work to do to get back over to the right-hand side for the chicane. And you can see we're opening the track up as much as is physically possible for the chicane to make sure that we are pretty much dead straight over the first apex, which is where we're going to get our braking done. And you can see here, quick step of the brake, down a gear, and you can see we're not quite using all of the curb because it's very easy to get a track limit penalty here. Throwing the car in over the right hand side and then getting back to the throttle pretty much as soon as we are at the apex. And you can see we're being very careful not to invalidate on the left hand side here. We do just keep it within track limits. And yeah, very quick sequence, and there's a lot to go over. So let's have a look on Coach Dave Delta to see how that looks from a data standpoint. So, once again, we are in Coach Dave Delta looking at that weird little chicane for Qatar Short. So, you can see we're braking with as much of a straight steering as we can into that corner. We're braking on the first apex. The reason we're braking straight is that if you're braking while steering to the left, the car will just be really destabilized and you'll just have a snap and it will be unstable and you'll lose a lot of time. So it's just a little bit easier, a little bit safer to brake while you're straight and on the first apex. And also it's better to brake before the corner so that you can power out through, carry the momentum and the speed through to that exit. As that is a bit of an overtaking opportunity potentially if you make a mistake or if the guy in front makes a mistake. And also it's just quicker and easier to do that. Because if you leave yourself too much to do and you're braking on the second apex, it's just going to be disastrous. You're going to destabilize the car and you're just going to lose so much momentum and time for that. And you can see as we're off the brake, we're pretty much straight back to trying to get back to the throttle. Not being too eager, because if you're too eager, you'll just invalidate on the exit. But you can see we get it just right on the GPS. You can see we're steering quite aggressively still. And then back to full throttle is when we start releasing the steering once again. And start making our way towards the triple right-hander. So let's see how we do the rest of the lap. Welcome back. So let's see the rest of the lap. So there's still a lot to go over. It's a very technical track. So now to the very challenging Sector 2, or what would be Sector 3 on the regular layout. Approaching the triple right-handers at a much higher speed than what you would normally be doing. So for that we make the provision to brake a little bit earlier, carry in a little less entry speed, just to make the corner a little bit easier. One thing to bear in mind is the car is very nervous through here, so be very careful to be really smooth on all inputs. Don't be too stabby on the brake on the entry, don't throw the steering in too much, and don't try and brake too deep into the corner because the car will just loop. So be very careful of that. You can see we're quite gentle on the brakes, down to gear 4, braking just before the 50-meter board, or just before the gantry. Being very smooth going in, using a bit of throttle to stabilise the rear. As mentioned before, the throttle can be a very useful tool to stabilise the rear by putting more weight backwards, as using the throttle shifts the weight towards the rear. Hooking this inside curb, but not too much, because if you hook too much you can either bottom or you can just loop round. The car is so sensitive at this high speed, almost 200 kph through the apex. Now back on the throttle, not too early because you can run out onto the gravel which will end your lap. Using just enough of the exit curb, then using this whole section as pretty much one long corner. You can see playing with the throttle, using again the right hand curb, using the exit curb but again not too much, braking a little bit, turning just after the gravel, well, actually turning a little bit early if anything on this lap, Fortunately enough, we do not get an invalidation. But again, I think if any larger cut than what I had here, and you would get an invalidation. You can see again, back to the throttle again, using it to stabilize the rear because the car is constantly dancing around. And then braking just before the mission inboard, down a gear. Using the orange on the outside to open up your corner. Getting back on the throttle just before the apex again to stabilize the car. Using the orange on the left hand side, but not too much because you can get a track limit ping. Using again the exit curb, but making sure not to go on the gravel. Bring the car right back over, nice and early for the final corner. Braking just before the mission inboard, using the orange as a track extension. Down to gear 2, hooking a bit of the pink on the inside of the curb. Getting back on the throttle once we know we're fully hooked. And then back full throttle. Not going too wide on the exit curb because you can get TC intervention if you tip a wheel beyond the curb. Or just use the curb with any sort of a slide. And that is a very short lap of Qatar Short. So, let's have a look at my top tips and things to mention for this ELMS Sprint race. So, as mentioned last week, the ELMS Sprint race is a triple multi-class, so there's 3 different classes. You're in the NMGT3s, you have the LMP3s, and you have the ELMS LMP2, which are very, very fast. And obviously around this track, with the high downforce nature of this circuit, the ELMS LMP2s are going to be quite awkward to negotiate. So be very wary through the triple right-hander, as that is definitely a danger zone for the ELMS LMP2s catching you up, and they will want to get through with a massive speed delta. With regards to strategy, I'd say it will be a simple one-stop. You might need to save energy a little bit to make the 40 minutes. Obviously, it's a 40-minute race. You have around 20 laps of energy, roughly. I think it's just under that. So you will want to try and hit 20-lap stints for the first stint at least. And that gives you a bit of flexibility to, maybe put in a little less energy for the second run. Tyre change, I probably wouldn't recommend a tyre change. I don't think it would be necessary for a 40 minutes since you only have 1 times tyre wear. However, if you are going to change tyres and you're dead set on that strategy, change the left side only. You will not need to change the right side at all, so make sure that you have that option checked. With regards to car choice, historically the higher downforce mid-engined cars do very well here. So the Ferrari that I'm driving here, the McLaren, the Porsche, being a rear-engined but high downforce, and the Lambo. Those are the 4 main cars that I think will be very, very strong. Maybe an outside shoe-in for the Merc, although it is a very, very difficult car to drive and does not handle the triple right-hander very well at all. So that is my main guide for the ELMS Sprint Cup. So, as you can see, the WEC Experience race is going to be at Sebring WEC layout. So, very difficult track with a lot of bumps that you need to really respect. And you'll notice throughout the lap that there's a lot of coasting and a lot of patience involved. So, let's get into it. So, for turn 1, the key is not to brake too late because you'll just tramline and you'll scrub off too much speed. The key is to brake earlier but less and roll a lot of speed through the corner. So, you can see we brake quite early, braking quite a bit before the wall ends, down to gear 3. And then you can see we are just coasting a long way into the corner. Only really getting onto the throttle just as we get under this sign. Back to the throttle. Using as much road as we can. Having the left wheels almost on the white line. And having the right wheels. In fact, the left wheels are on the white line. But yeah, you can use the grass on the exit here. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it as a consistent thing, but for raw pace, it's definitely doable and viable because it is relatively smooth out there. But just make sure that you can bring the car back over to the left, around the middle of the track, so that we have a straight braking point for turn 2. Brake just before the 200 board or the 200 line on the ground, whichever one is either there, because the board will probably get taken out, or whichever you prefer. Down to gear 2, train the brake in, taking a relatively early turn-in point, but kind of hugging the yellow line on the left. Getting back on the throttle just as the curb kind of ends. And then hooking it over this right-hand curb. You don't have to do this. The main reason I tend to is to keep the car as far to the right-hand side as possible for the next left. So as long as you keep that mindset there of keeping the car to the right-hand side, you should be okay without necessarily needing to use the curb. And you can see we are quite far over to the right-hand side. We've only got really half a car width, if that, on the right-hand side, and we've got a lot of space to the left. There is one thing worth mentioning, though, is that in the race, it might be better to take a more narrow line towards the left, just to cover off any overtaking opportunities if you get a bad run through the previous section. Down to gear 2, coasting a long time, and then using a bit of brake at the end of the cornering zone, just to get a bit of weight over the front axle so that the front bites in a bit more at the end. And then as we get to the apex, we get back on the throttle. Letting the car run out on the curb, and just keeping nice and narrow to the right-hand side, keeping the shortest possible line towards Sector 2. Or towards the end of Sector 1, sorry. Now for braking, we brake just after the 400 board, or the 400 line, which is the first line on the ground, about 350. Down to gear 1, keeping the car nice and straight until trailing the car in, throwing the car in quite aggressively into this corner because of the bumps, trying to get the car swung over, hooking the inside curb. You see we do manage to just hook the curb at the later phase of the corner. Be careful not to turn in too early because you'll end up hitting the yellow sausage curb, which will just massively inhibit your cornering and your run down the next straight, as it's a relatively long straight and a good overtaking zone. Back on the throttle, we use a bit of TC override over the curb and gravel on the left. And now you get a bit of breathing space into Sector 2. And now coming into this corner, you're going to brake at the 300 line, or the second line that you get to on the ground. Down to gear 2, trailing in, touching the inside curb for a bit of extra rotation, then back on the throttle, clipping the left curb, keeping the shortest line towards the next section. Now this is probably the hardest corner on the circuit, in my opinion, in terms of just how inconsistent it is. And that's mostly because of just how bumpy the entry phase is and how much elevation, surprisingly enough, there is into the corner. There's a lot of camber changes, and we will go over that in Coach Dave Delta first. So here we are at the downhill right-hander. It's a very difficult corner, this one, deceptively difficult, because it seems on the surface like quite a simple corner, but if you think about the bumps that are there, and also the fact that the corner heavily cambers in a very downhill, fashion into the apex of the corner, it means that it's very difficult to get the braking right. Mostly because of the bumps and the elevation change, causing the ABS to kick in quite a lot if you trail too deep, and that's caused the car to tramline. So you want to get the braking done very sharp and very quickly. So you can see we're braking in a straight line as you look at the GPS, and you can see we're straight off the brake before we even really start turning. In fact, it's pretty much simultaneously as we start turning. You can see the steering trace is around 5.37% to the right at the peak of braking, and then as soon as we're trailing off, we're at like 30% steering. So you can see we're trailing off very aggressively there, basically to mean that we don't engage the ABS too much into that corner, because again, the car just won't stop and it will just tramline straight wide. So trailing off as we're turning into the corner, making sure that we're getting the car into the corner nice and smoothly, getting to the apex, and then as soon as we're at the apex, we start applying the throttle to get out of that corner. Not to run too wide though, because if you get on the grass, you will just engage TC. Welcome back. So let's see what this corner looks like in a visual form. So you can see we're getting over to the left-hand side quite quickly, braking just before the curb starts, down to gear 2. Quite a hard initial hit at the brake, as I mentioned in the Delta segment. Trailing off quite gradually though, almost coasting at this point, down to gear 2. And then a slight clip of the curb, pretty much on the yellow line. You ideally want to just hit the yellow line, but I had a slight clip of the curb, and luckily it didn't really hinder us too much. Getting back on the throttle on the exit, getting a very straight exit, not using too much of that exit curb or using any of the grass, because you'll just bog down as the TC will cut in too much. And now, another brake before you get into Sector 3. It's just about carrying the shortest possible line on the left and making sure you are right on the white line coming to this corner. Braking at the 300, braking a bit early, carrying not as much entry speed as you probably could, but prioritizing roll speed and stability through this section, because ultimately you want to prioritize the last right-hander, because then you have a long back straight to the last corner. So you can see going in nice and slow, coasting quite a bit, getting back on the throttle once we've hooked this curb, and then going from curb to curb, keeping the car right over the left-hand side, basically keeping the right wheel just over the white line on the right-hand side, down a gear briefly before short shifting for traction, getting back on the throttle as we hook this curb, and let the car run out, again, not too far off the exit curb, not on the grass, because that will inhibit traction and exit speed. And then, the last braking point of the track, probably the hardest braking point, just in terms of how bumpy it is. And you can see, braking just after the 100, or just on the 100 line, actually. Down to third, braking nice and straight, not too wide though, because otherwise you'll just completely miss the corner. Down to second briefly, and then as we get over the massive bump on the apex here, we short shift just before it, get back on the throttle after that bump, and keep it nice and narrow on the right hand side, but then letting the car run out eventually over this white line. And that is a lap of Sebring. So let's go through my tips and tricks for this daily race. So it's a multi-class race, so obviously you have the LM GT3s and the hypercars. Be very mindful as a GT3 that the hypercars are around 15 seconds or so a lap quicker, so be careful that they will be approaching you at high speed. You will get lapped a couple of times, I'd say, in this race. It's a 40-minute race, so I don't think there'll be any pit stops. I think even if you're a little bit on the close side, you can definitely lift and coast to save. There's a lot of opportunities at Sebring to lift and coast to save the energy if needed. With regards to car choice, it's pretty open, to be honest. I think the Lambo seems pretty strong, obviously on quali pace. The Porsche is always a good race car, but the BOP genuinely seems pretty good at Sebring. It seems like they're pretty open for choice. So pick a car that suits you. Me personally, I'd probably choose the Mustang because I like it, but there's definitely a lot of options. All cars seem to be buzzing around the same ballpark figure of around the low 2 minutes on quali pace and around probably the high 2 minutes, low 2:01 on race pace. So for the first daily race that we have this week, we are going to be looking at the LM GT3 fixed races for the bronze tier, and the track is going to be Fuji WEC layout with the rather awkward chicane in Sector 2, probably to the dismay of most of you watching. But it's a very difficult track, this one of my favourites, but very, very difficult because there aren't many concrete brake markers, and a lot of the apexes are actually blind going in, so it's going to be quite difficult to guide you through. But I will do my best, as is always the case, and I will look through some delta data at certain points of the lap to hopefully make that a little bit clearer for you going into these races. So first things first, coming down towards turn 1, which is a relatively straightforward braking zone despite it being downhill. We brake around the 120, 130 meter boards, so kind of midway between these two brake boards here. And we brake actually closer to the 100 meter board because obviously this fixed setup has quite a bit of rear wing on, so we are able to brake quite late. Down towards gear 1, you can see as we're getting towards gear 2, we start trailing the car in because obviously it's off camber downhill, so we're going to try and aim for the inside curb. We don't quite get it on this occasion, but it's not really a worry because we're still on the white line and we're able to trail through nice to get the front end hooked around the corner well enough. And again, back on the throttle again, we only use the red and white on this exit curb because if you use any more, you'll bounce and lose a lot of time due to TC intervention. Now, going up to the right-hander, we use a lot of the entry curb. Here is probably the hardest corner on track to get right, in my opinion, because of how little references you have. You see here, we're just about to brake, but what are we using as a reference? You know, it's so hard to see. But funny enough, what I use are completely on the left-hand side. So you see this orange barrier on the left-hand side. I use that as one of my references, and then the actual curb on the apex, when it comes into view, I use that as my reference. So I brake midway between those, sometimes on the orange barrier, sometimes as late as the apex curb appearing. It kind of just depends on your car. But you can see on this occasion here, we brake pretty much midway between the 50 and the 100, just after the orange and just as we start seeing this apex curb come into view. We're down a gear, a little bit tentative on the way in because again, the apex is still blind. And we also don't want to take too much of this curb because it will bounce you really high and you will most likely spin. So be very careful to only take the green AstroTurf if you're going to take this curb. And then back on the throttle again, making sure not to use too much exit curb because you will get invalidation. And to see how to do that corner in a bit more of an objective way rather than just looking at the references that you can't really see on the track, let's have a look at the Coach Dave Delta app. So as promised, we are going to be looking at turn 2 on Coach Dave Delta. You can see a very quick hit of the brake going into the left-hander. Straight off the brake, with only a little bit of steering on, you can see with 7.89% on the left steering. But you can see as soon as we're off the brake, we start applying even more lock. We got up to around 22% steering, which is not a huge amount, honestly. You can see we were still very, very smooth, very, very tentative going in, as we saw on the replay. We have a small blip of the throttle, just to stabilise the car before hitting the curb. But other than that, we are coasting for a very long time. And you can see actually, as we hit the curb, that is when we start hitting the throttle. So we only start really applying it as we get to the curb, using the throttle fully straight away. So we're very, very early on the throttle, making sure to release the steering as we're on the throttle. And you can see pretty much exactly at the same time, we reach our peak steering pressure, peak steering lock, and then we go straight back onto the throttle. And then we run that exit curb as we saw on the replay. So that is how you approach turn 2. Okay, welcome back. So as you can see, we're just using this exit curb. And then here, you can actually see I've used a bit of the grass on previous laps. And that is what I tried to do on fixed setup. But if you're not confident enough to do that, try and aim for this at least grey part of the track just beyond the white line, as it really helps hook the car around. Especially when the car is a little bit understeery, so generally on the fixed setups, you do have a little bit more understeer built in inherently to make it safer for you. So if you need a little bit more rotation through this corner, it's a very, very long one, very, very fast corner. So be sure to use a little bit of this grey on the right-hand side. You can see we managed to get it. We're keeping relatively close to the white line, playing around with the throttle, but crucially not the brake. If you try and stab the brake middle of the corner, the car will be unsettled and you'll likely spin. So if you could try and get the rotation with just your throttle, do it. But if you need to apply the brake, be as silky smooth as possible. You only really want to put a few % of brake pressure in, if any, to get the car around the corner. You can see we're coasting quite a bit, using a bit of throttle towards the end of the corner to get a bit of the rotation with the differential. And in stark contrast to turn 1 on the exit, you actually want to use this checkerboard on the right-hand side because it really helps pull the car back round the corner. And obviously with the car being quite understeery through this long right-hander, you want as much help as you can to get the car through. And then you can see here, we get it just right. We're about the middle of the circuit. And if we go third person, yep, you can see we're actually further across to the right hand side as, compared to the left. And then into this corner, another blind corner. So in 3 or 4 corners, we've had already 2 blind apexes. So you can see why this track is a massive problem for a lot of people. But luckily, in this corner, we have a much more concrete brake reference. Well, compared to turn 2 at least. You can see we use the end of that left-hand curb as our braking marker. So we brake just at the end of that, down to gear 2, using a bit of the entry curb on the way in and making sure to hook the left-hand curb for extra rotation. You can see we only just, again, take the red and white. You can hook a little bit onto the red part, but I'd say that it's probably better just to keep to the red and white because the car can react badly to the bounce on the red part. And we use a big throttle application just as we hit the curb. Then the car run out right to the white line and the exit curb. And now you get a bit of a breather before what is the most irritating braking zone on the entirety of the circuit. And again, I'll show you why. So here, we are braking here. And you look to the left. Why have you broken here? There's no references. You look to the right, there's a 100-meter board, but we're nowhere near it. And there's no other braking boards to be seen. So what did we use? And now if I go back a few seconds, it might become a little bit clearer. So you also have this orange bit part of the wall here on the right-hand side. You have the gantry just above it. And then a little bit further forward, you have this Goodyear sign on the right. Now, I tend to use the orange wall and the 100-meter board as a braking reference, kind of braking between those, and that's kind of about feel. But what I found you can actually use, if you're able to, is brake around where this Goodyear board starts to go out of view. You can actually see we brake as we get alongside that Goodyear board, roughly. So that is what we kind of look at. But if you're not confident with that, just kind of use the 100-meter board or the second Goodyear sign, or the second Goodyear word on the right-hand side. Again, there's really not that much to go on for this corner, unfortunately. But it's always better, I'd say, to go in a little bit slower, brake a little bit earlier, but trail off, and you'll see why in a second. So we come in, braking along the left-hand side curb, down to gear 1. You can see as we're down to gear 1, we start trailing our way into the corner, making sure to try and hook the very back of this curb, using the red as well to hook us round. And you can see we are very far to the right-hand side without compromising our exit, and that gives us such a nice go-through for the left-hander. And again, this corner is very, very difficult because you're so traction limited. You're in gear 1, sometimes gear 2 depending on the car, but you're in low speed, lots of torque, and you need to try and get as much throttle as you can, otherwise the car just won't move. So you're constantly in the TC here, but because we've kept the car over to the right-hand side on the exit of the right-hander, we're able to get a much smoother run through the left. And you can see we're almost completely flat running through the TC here. And then we were able to keep it on the track limits, crucially not running onto the red and white with our left-hand wheels, because if you do, you will get a track limit. It's actually very harsh through this section, because it got updated a few months ago, so just something to bear in mind if you haven't driven the track a huge amount recently. And now running the car right out to the left-hand side, you can see we're braking just after this small white line on the ground, or I tend to use when this Avis board on the right-hand side of this Avis barrier kind of disappears off to the right-hand side. That's generally what I use as my braking point. Not full pressure, but just sort of trailing the car in, because it's a very long, relatively high roll speed corner. We hook the inside curb, but not on the notched up part, just on the lower level, because otherwise the car will just bounce badly. You can see we're back on the throttle again as we hit the inside curb, using it to rotate the car. And then again, just slightly on the notched part on the left-hand side, but not too much, because again, you will get a track limit ping. Just like the previous chicane, this track limit corner got updated and made more harsh, as is the case with the next exit curb in the next corner. So a lot more stuff to be mindful of than was previously the case a few months ago. And you can see down to gear 2, or we will be down to gear 2. Just after this curb, we're dabbing the brake. Again, just like the previous one, not full brake because we want to roll as much roll speed through because it's a very, very long corner, very, very long braking zone. Going out nice and wide, making sure to hook the inside curb just on the green, but not too little because otherwise the car will just bounce badly. We're back on the throttle. Again, using this notched up part of the right-hand exit curb to keep us on track, similar to turn 2. But again, if you use too much, you will get a track limit. And then using the orange wall on the right to get to have a braking marker, braking just as it goes off screen. Down to gear 2, keeping to the middle of the circuit, and then it's a waiting game, waiting very, very patiently till we get to the apex, and then back on the throttle just before we get there. Making sure to let the car run out nice and wide, but not too much on the exit curb, because this car and also other cars just bounce badly on the exit curb and can have TC intervention. And this exit is obviously very crucial because it's a very long straight. So that was our lap that we did. So something I actually forgot to go over, or didn't really show in great detail on the lap, was coming through the chicane. So you can see, again, as I mentioned, very hard on the brake. Back to full throttle pretty quickly, but you can see through the left-hander itself in that chicane and looking at the GPS, we're actually quite jaggedy on the throttle. Because the car is trying to slip as we transition from the right to the left. And that's something that I actually didn't really notice because I just assumed it was the TC cutting in. But actually, we are playing around with the throttle a little bit because we are so traction limited. So that's something to bear in mind, that you probably will have to be a little bit proactive on the throttle through that section, because the car will just move around that extra bit as you apply the throttle. So it makes it almost impossible to be a smooth application. So just something to bear in mind for that very difficult section, especially in race trim, when the tyres start to wear a little bit towards the end of the 20 minutes. And now for my synopsis on this Fuji fixed race. So first and foremost, it's going to be around 12 or 13 laps. So I'd recommend putting in around 40%, maybe a little bit more energy depending on the car. Which is usually equating to around 35 to 40 litres, maybe a little bit more, just depends on the car, because obviously some cars, such as the Lambo, consume a lot more fuel than, for example, the Ferrari or the Mustang. As for cars I'd recommend, obviously on an open setup, it would definitely be the Lambo, definitely be the Corvette and the McLaren and such. But I think on fixed setup, I'd say the Ferrari seems like a pretty good pick, honestly, looking at this uptime that we did. The Lambo is always going to be a good pick. It's just a fast car at this track. The McLaren seems to have a pretty strong fixed setup and seems to be quite a popular choice, as is the case with the Porsche. So you're pretty spoilt for choice. I think the Ferrari seems pretty quick down the straight as well. So if that's something that you're kind of looking for, then that's definitely something to think of. So yeah, it's a 20-minute race, pretty straightforward, no pit stops. So that is it for this week's daily races on Le Mans Ultimate. I've been Luke Whitehead on the Coach Dave Le Mans Ultimate YouTube channel, and I hope you found this guide helpful. If you did, leave a like, subscribe if you're new, make sure to leave a comment down below if you have any other questions or requests, and enjoy this week of racing. Take care guys, and see you next week. Goodbye.